I found the locked metal box tucked behind the false back of my late husband's gun safe 3 days after his funeral. Inside was a single handwritten page with 6 words. Do not trust Amelia. Save yourself. I didn't know then that I'd soon be fighting for my life against my stepdaughter, a woman who would forge partnership papers, try to steal an $800,000 horse property out from under me, and ultimately learn that the live feed from Stable Justice would broadcast her permanent banishment from the only home I ever rebuilt with my bare hands. This is the story of how I beat her at her own game, using the skills she never knew I had, and a trap my husband set before he died, a trap that turned a simple notebook into a weapon. I was a 52-year-old widow who had spent 30 years as the bookkeeper for Tom's small construction company. I balanced his ledgers by hand, spotted a fake invoice from 20 paces, and could reconcile a job-costing report while a concrete truck idled outside. But that was only half of what I brought to the table. Before I married Tom, I had apprenticed with an industrial electrician named Marty Schrader, a grizzled man who talked to his wire strippers like they were pets, and taught me how to pull 3-phase circuits through a warehouse ceiling without nicking the insulation. I'd spent enough weekends bending EMT conduit and landing breakers in live panels that I could rewire a subpanel in the dark by feel alone. Later, when Tom's company hit a rough patch and we were losing tool crib keys on job sites twice a month, I bought a practice lock set from a catalogue and taught myself basic locksmithing, learning how to shim a padlock, how to decode a wafer lock by the click of its wafers, and how to open a corroded job box with nothing but a tension wrench I filed down from a broken feeler gauge and a pick I bent from a street sweeper bristle. These were the invisible skills of a woman who fixed things behind the scenes, and they were the only reason I survived what came next. I never listed them on a resume, but they were woven into my hands like thread. When a pulmonary embolism took Tom without warning on a Tuesday morning while he was loading a pallet of shingles, I sat in our empty kitchen and stared at a check for $120,000, the full payout from his life insurance. I had no pension, no savings to speak of, just a double wide on a gravel lot, a paid-off 2003 F-150, and a stepdaughter named Amelia who called me 3 hours after the memorial. She was Tom's daughter from his first marriage, a 29-year-old dressage hopeful who spent weekends posting pictures of champagne-coloured ponies on social media and who had never once volunteered to muck a stall in her life. She showed up with a slick, image-obsessed husband named Brett, a man who wore loafers without socks, described himself as a land-use strategist, and had a habit of licking his lips before he told a lie. I'll skip the long history. All you need to know is that I'd spent years being the invisible woman who funded their dreams while I mucked stalls and kept Tom's books. And the moment he was gone, that invisible woman was supposed to sign everything away. The Monday after the funeral, before the floral arrangements had even dropped their petals, Amelia and Brett sat at my kitchen table with a folder full of crisp documents. They wanted to help. Amelia had a dream, she reminded me, a dream we'd all built together. 3 years earlier, I'd emptied my entire widow's inheritance into a rundown horse stable 8 miles outside town. It was 8 acres of muddy pasture, a pole barn with a leaning roof, and a rat-infested tack room that smelled of ancient mold. I wrote a check for the down payment on the property, and then I spent every weekend for 2 years doing the actual work, rebuilding stalls with lumber I salvaged from Tom's demolition sites, grading the arena with a borrowed skid steer, and rewiring the breaker panel because the original one had aluminum branch wiring that sparked whenever the well pump kicked on. I even pulled new circuits for the wash rack, using the leftover 12-gauge THHN wire from Tom's last big commercial job, stringing it through EMT I bent by hand because the existing conduit was rusted through. Amelia provided the name, Silver Crest Dressage, and the logo, a stylized horse head that cost me $1,200 to have an artist design for the sign. On paper, we were 50-50 partners in an LLC. Tom had insisted on it. He'd drawn up the operating agreement himself, triple-checked the language with a business attorney, and filed it with the county clerk's office with a receipt he kept in his wallet. I thought it was his way of binding us together after he was gone, a safety net made of shavings and arena dust. Now Amelia and Brett were telling me I needed to step back. I was grieving, they said, and the stable was too much for one woman. They'd already drafted a document that simplified things. Brett slid a thin stack of pages across the table, a partnership dissolution agreement that would transfer my share of the LLC to Amelia for $10 and other good and valuable consideration. He used words like estate planning and streamlined management, and when he leaned forward I caught a whiff of his cologne, something sharp and expensive that Tom would have called overpriced poison. I picked up the pen they'd placed beside my coffee cup, saw their breathing slow in unison, saw Amelia's thumb twitch toward her phone, and I signed absolutely nothing. I told them my head was foggy, that I couldn't think straight, that I needed a few days to look things over. Amelia's smile never wavered, but her eyes flicked to Brett, and I saw a muscle jump in his jaw, a tiny involuntary tick that I catalogued the way I used to catalogue a contractor's suspicious change order. That was the first crack, and I began to see the fault lines spreading. That night I drove out to the stable alone. The air still smelled like creosote and alfalfa, but something felt wrong. I walked through the empty barn, my boots echoing on the concrete aisle, and into Tom's old tool room, a space he'd claimed even before we bought the property. It was 10 feet by 12, with a workbench he'd built from a solid core door and a pegboard still hung with his hammers and chisels. There, tucked behind a stack of unused stall mats that still carried the faint rubber smell of a tire shop, sat a dented metal lockbox I'd never seen before. It was small, maybe 8 inches across, painted olive drab with a faint stenciled number on the side, a military surplus box from an era before Tupperware. It had a cheap wafer lock that could be jimmied with a screwdriver if you didn't care about leaving marks. But I didn't have a screwdriver on me, and I knew that forcing a wafer lock without the right tension can jam the wafers permanently, turning a simple bypass into a destructive mess. Instead, I used a bobby pin I kept in my coat pocket for exactly this kind of moment, and a slim tension wrench I'd filed down from an old feeler gauge years ago, tools I carried out of habit the way other women carry lipstick. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applied light clockwise pressure until I felt the first wafer bind. Then I raked the bobby pin's tip across the wafers in a brisk in and out motion. On the third pass I felt the satisfying click of all wafers aligning, and the cylinder turned with a smooth rotation. I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a chamois cloth that still smelled of gun oil, was a cheap composition notebook with a black and white marbled cover. On the last page, in Tom's cramped architectural lettering, all caps and perfectly aligned, I read the words, "Do not trust Amelia. She'll bleed you dry. The key is in the floor. Save yourself." I had no idea what floor or what key, but the warning hit me like a physical blow, a cold pressure that settled in my sternum. I closed the box just as I heard tires on gravel, the crunch of a luxury SUV that was too quiet for the farm road. I scooped it up and carried it toward my truck, but Amelia's white Escalade swung onto the drive, headlights cutting through the dusk. She jumped out, saw the box in my hands, and called it a piece of junk, something Tom had used for spare shotgun shells. She took it from me, her fingers cold and quick, and tossed it into the dumpster behind the barn with a casual flick of her wrist. "You really shouldn't be out here alone at night," she said, her voice soft but her grip on my elbow unbreakable, guiding me like a prisoner. She drove me back to the house they'd already started calling hers, a mid-century ranch they'd bought a year earlier with a down payment I later learned came from a loan Tom had co-signed without my knowledge. I waited until 2 in the morning, when the house was silent and the streetlight outside my window had flickered off on its timer. I slipped out the guest room window, easing the sash up inch by inch to avoid the squeal of old springs, and I stepped over the gardenia bushes, careful not to snap a branch. I walked 3 miles back to that stable with a flashlight between my teeth, the beam bouncing with my strides. The walk was long and cold, the November air biting through my barn coat, and I catalogued every shadow, every sound, because that's what you do when you know you're being hunted on your own land. A fox screamed in the distance, and I froze until I was sure it wasn't a human voice. The dumpster was overflowing with Tom's old things they'd thrown away that very afternoon without asking me. His red wingwork boots, the left one still scarred from a nail he'd stepped on at highway job, a stack of job site binders with his handwritten notes on concrete pours and lumber takeoffs, the framed photo of us at our wedding, the glass now cracked across my face. I dug through coffee grounds and hay chaff and shards of a broken mirror until my fingers closed around the lockbox. I wiped it clean, held it to my chest, and walked back, my legs aching and my heart full of something I couldn't name yet. In my room I opened the notebook again, and on the last page I reread the 6 words that would anchor me for the weeks ahead. Do not trust Amelia. Save yourself. I tucked the notebook into the lining of my overnight bag, where I had already sewn a hidden pocket from an old pillowcase, and I began to plan. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family isn't defined by blood, but by who stands beside you when the money runs out. The morning after I found the notebook, I became the best actress I'd ever been. I shuffled into their kitchen wearing an old cardigan that had a coffee stain on the cuff, and I let my shoulders slump inward. I called Amelia by the wrong name twice, first Alice and then Andrea, watching her jaw tighten each time. I let my voice quaver when I asked for tea, and I let Brett fill a mug with lukewarm coffee that tasted of old grounds and impatience. He explained that the stable was a liability now, that a developer named Crestview Holdings had offered $750,000 cash for the land, and that if I didn't sign the dissolution papers soon, we'd all lose the opportunity. He stressed the word opportunity like a revival preacher stressing salvation. They needed me to come to the title company's office on Friday and finalize everything. They said it was for my protection. I tilted my head like a parakeet, let my eyes go unfocused, and said I just needed a few more days to get my bearings. I mentioned that my memory was foggy and that I sometimes forgot where I put my keys. Brett patted my hand and said, of course, take all the time you need, but there was a vein pulsing in his temple that told a different story. I filed that away too, because a bookkeeper learns to spot the tiny tells that precede a bounced check or a doctored receipt, the way a man's signature sharpens when he's lying. Within a week, they moved me into their guest suite, a beige box of a bedroom with a single window that faced the stucco wall of the neighboring house, so close that I could touch it if I stretched. They took my truck keys, telling me I wasn't safe to drive, and they installed a ring camera over the front door so they could keep an eye on me. I let them install that camera, and I memorized its blind spot, which was a 2-foot gap behind the gardenia bushes on the north side of the house, a gap created by a misaligned downspout that cast a shadow the lens couldn't adjust for. I spent my first night in that room drawing a map of every vent, every light fixture, every squeaky floorboard I'd need to avoid, using the margin of a newspaper I'd found in the recycling. The next day, I accidentally broke the curtain rod in my room and asked Brett to replace it, which gave me the chance to study the window lock and note that it could be lifted from the outside with a thin blade. I started practicing in my mind the route I would take if I needed to leave undetected, counting steps, and memorizing the timing of the neighbors' automatic sprinklers that would mask the sound of my footsteps. And I started listening. Amelia paced the kitchen at odd hours, phone pressed to her ear, her voice a thin, frayed whisper that cut through the wall. I'd press a water glass against the drywall near the laundry chute, which I had discovered shared a common air return with the kitchen after tracing the ductwork in the basement one afternoon while pretending to look for a lost earring. The air return acted like a crude intercom, funneling sound upward from the kitchen island where she always took her calls. I captured fragments of their panic. The hard money terms are brutal, Brett. We need her signature before the note resets. Crestview won't extend the contingency. If she finds out about the lien. The word lien stuck in my mind like a sliver, but I didn't understand its full meaning yet. I kept a pocket notebook of my own, a small spiral pad I'd bought at a gas station, and I logged times and dates and snippets of dialogue, every entry penned in the same shorthand I'd used for years to document contractor disputes. If I was going down, I was going down with a paper trail, a habit that had saved Tom's company from 3 lawsuits and would now save me. I started paying attention to the financial litter they left behind. A credit card statement on the hall table, left half hidden under a stack of Pottery Barn catalogs, showed a $50,000 cash advance at 24% APRA taken out against the credit limit of a card Brett had opened using what looked like my social security number. The statement listed charges from a cosmetic dentist in Scottsdale, a high-end furniture store in Dallas, and a deposit at a luxury car dealership for a vehicle I'd never seen. These were spending patterns that had nothing to do with a woman who wore the same barn coat for 11 winters. I recognized the fraud instantly because I'd once spent 6 months untangling an identity theft case for one of Tom's subcontractors, a painter whose credit had been wrecked by a nephew using a cloned card. I photographed the statement with my burner phone, a prepaid flip phone I'd bought at a Walmart 3 towns over with cash, and I kept walking. A few days later, I found a half-shredded document in their recycling bin, a faxed amortization schedule that had been torn by hand but not fully destroyed, the pieces still large enough to reassemble. I waited until the house was quiet, then locked myself in the bathroom and reconstructed the page with clear tape and a steady hand, piecing together the jagged edges the way I'd once reconstructed damaged blueprints for a building permit. It revealed a predatory bridge loan with a balloon payment of $480,000 due in 60 days, secured by the stable property. I recognized the loan structure immediately because I'd spent years clawing Tom's company out of similar traps, negotiating with hard money lenders who prey on people with bad credit. The interest rate was 18%, compounded monthly. The prepayment penalty alone was 6 figures. The collateral description matched our parcel ID exactly, and scrawled in the margin of the fax in Brett's looping handwriting was a note: close sale before balloon hits, even if signature has to be forced. That word, forced, sent a chill down my spine, and I added the reconstructed document to my growing evidence file, which I kept in a Ziploc bag hidden inside the guest room's air vent. The household accident came on a Tuesday. The guest bathroom had a dripping faucet, a slow, steady percussion that kept me awake, and that I had come to use as a metronome for my own thoughts. One morning, Amelia barged in without knocking and found me standing under the sink with a basin wrench in my hand, the old faucet cartridge already removed, and a new one waiting on the vanity. I'd bought the replacement cartridge at a hardware store during a rare unsupervised errand, using cash, and I'd already wrapped the stem threads with Teflon tape. She stared at me and I almost broke character, but I let my hands tremble just enough and I said I didn't want to be a bother. I used to do this for Tom all the time. It helps me feel useful. I didn't say that I'd installed the same model faucet in 6 spec houses and could dismantle it blindfolded. She backed out slowly, muttering about calling a plumber. She never did. I replaced the cartridge in 12 minutes, bleeding the air from the lines and testing the seal. While I was under there, I noticed the water shut-off valve had been painted over by a sloppy hand, a thick brushstroke of eggshell paint that covered the valve stem. It was the exact shade of eggshell I'd used on the stall doors at the stable 2 years ago, paint I'd mixed myself because the original color was discontinued. That tiny link between their pristine house and my sweat equity lit a cold fire in my chest. A few days later, a similar opportunity arose when the overhead fluorescent fixture in the hallway flickered out. Brett was fumbling with a step stool and cursing the breaker box, completely clueless about which breaker controlled the hall lights. I shuffled over, gave him a vague explanation about how I used to change bulbs for Tom, and I pulled the cover off the service panel, a 200-amp square D-box that I recognized by the bus bar layout because I'd installed its twin at the stable. I switched off the correct breaker after reading the faint pencil label on the bus that said Hall LT, which Brett had never noticed. I tested the circuit with the back of my hand, a habit from my apprenticeship, and I replaced the fixture's ballast with a spare I'd seen in the garage, an old magnetic ballast that was still good. It took me 8 minutes, and when the light flickered back to life, they looked at me like I'd performed a magic trick. In that moment I understood how deeply they underestimated what lived inside me, how they saw a frail widow instead of a woman who could rewire a barn and outlast a prairie winter. That night I used a bobby pin and a strip of mylar I'd peeled from a potato chip bag to pop the flimsy wafer lock on the filing cabinet in Brett's home office. I'd scouted the lock earlier, noting it was a basic 4-pin wafer mechanism, the kind you can rake in seconds if you know the tension. I waited until the house was dark and the hum of the central air masked any small sounds. I inserted my makeshift tension wrench, a bent hairpin, into the bottom of the keyway and applied a slight clockwise torque. I ran the bobby pin's tip across the wafers in a brisk zigzag, and on the third pass the cylinder gave with a soft click. Inside the top drawer, suspended in a hanging green folder labeled Silver Crest Archive, I found the smoking gun, a set of partnership dissolution papers already notarized with my signature neatly forged at the bottom. The signature was good. Too good. The R in my first name had the correct backward slant, and the H in my last name carried the tiny loop I only made when I was riding with my favorite fountain pen, the one Tom gave me for our 10th anniversary. But I hadn't written it, and I knew someone had traced it from a check I'd signed months ago because the ink density was perfectly uniform, a dead giveaway of a practiced forgery rather than natural hand pressure. I had spotted forgeries before, back when a subcontractor tried to pass off a pay application with a fake client signature, and I'd caught it because the pen pressure on the downstrokes was too consistent. This was the same tell. Behind that document was a purchase and sale agreement with Crestview Holdings, a company I later learned was owned by a Shell LLC that traced back to Brett's cousin through a Nevada-registered agent. The sale price was $800,000. Closing was scheduled for the following Friday, and the contract explicitly stated that the sale was contingent on the LLC's remaining partner, meaning Amelia, delivering a clean title free of any claim from the deceased partner's widow. I also found a printed email from an online notary stamp vendor that sold counterfeit embossers for $50, and the shipping address was Brett's office. The email included a scanned image of a valid notary stamp from our state, which Brett had apparently used as a template to order a replica. They were going to close, pocket the cash, and leave me with a forged document, a stripped LLC, and the debt from the bridge loan they'd taken out in my name. The debt service alone would have buried me under payments of nearly $9,000 a month, a sum I could never sustain on a widow's income. I used my burner phone to photograph every page, front and back, using the side of the filing cabinet to steady my hands. I then put everything back exactly as I'd found it, realigning the folders to the millimeter and wiping the drawer pull with a corner of my sleeve to remove any oils. I even flicked a tiny bit of dust I'd collected from the windowsill over the drawer pull to disguise any disturbance. Then I sat on my bed in the dark and thought about the key in the floor, the note from Tom. I'd put it off because I didn't know what the floor meant, but now the timeline was collapsing. I had less than a week before the fake closing. I slipped out again that same night, using the gardenia gap and walking the 3 miles in the dark for the second time in a month. The moon was a sliver, and I navigated mostly by memory, counting the fence posts along the gravel road. Inside the barn, I switched on a single low-wattage work light I'd left hidden beneath a feed sack. I began counting floorboards from the north wall, following an old habit Tom had taught me during a kitchen remodel when we'd hidden a time capsule for our anniversary. 7 boards in, then 2 to the left. He'd said once about a different hiding spot, but that memory surfaced unbidden as if he were whispering in my ear. I knelt and began tapping the boards with the butt of my flashlight, listening for the hollow thump that signals a void beneath. I worked methodically, tapping every board in the aisle and marking the sound in my mind. Thud, 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 and then a dull ring on the 9th board from the north wall, a resonance that meant there was empty space below. I pried it up using a crowbar I'd stashed behind the water trough 2 weeks earlier, the nails protesting with a screech. There, nestled in a cutout in the joists and cushioned by a scrap of old carpet padding, was a waterproof pelican case, the kind serious photographers use. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter from Tom, 2 pages on yellow legal paper, a thumb drive wrapped in bubble wrap, and a single brass key that had been labeled floor safe with a Dymo tape. I set the key aside for later investigation. The letter explained everything. A year before he died, Tom had suspected Amelia and Brett were fishing for his assets. They'd been asking peculiar questions about the LLC's structure, about what happened to the stable if I wasn't around, and Brett had even joked about how power of attorney is a beautiful thing. Tom, who had seen contractor fraud in a dozen forms, recognized the scent of rot. He'd amended our LLC operating agreement in secret, hiring a lawyer through a separate bank account I didn't know existed, and filed the amendment with the county recorder's office. The amendment embedded a clause that any dissolution or transfer of my ownership interest required a notarized consent form executed in person at the county recorder's office, accompanied by a verbal password known only to me. The password, he wrote, was the name of the street where we'd first met, Cottonwood. He'd also filed a UCC-1 financing statement against the property, a quiet lien that would surface the moment any title search was conducted for a sale. The lien listed me as the secured party for a fabricated promissory note worth $400,000. Until that lien was satisfied, no title company would insure a transfer, and the only way to satisfy it was to appear in person with me, the actual me, and the password. He'd also placed a copy of the original LLC agreement and the UCC filing on the thumb drive, along with scanned receipts, notes on his suspicions, and a journal entry dated the day he filed the paperwork, in which he wrote, "She's the only one who ever loved me without wanting a receipt." I held that letter and cried until my ribs hurt, the sobs echoing in the empty barn, but the tears were not grief. They were relief, sharp and clarifying, the kind you feel when you discover that someone you loved saw you, truly saw you, and built a fortress around you without saying a word. The next morning, I called the attorney whose name appeared at the bottom of the UCC filing. His name was Paul Gerlach, a wiry man in his 60s with a voice like gravel and a reputation for specializing in real estate fraud. I met him at a diner 2 towns over, a place called The Griddle that served pancakes the size of hubcaps. I drove myself in Amelia's second car, a Honda Civic they kept for errands, which I'd borrowed by telling her I needed to pick up a prescription for an anxiety medication I didn't actually take. I had practiced the errand lie in the mirror, making sure my voice quavered just enough. I showed Paul the forged dissolution papers, the fraudulent loan documents with my social security number, the photographs of the purchase agreement, the reconstructed amortization schedule, and Tom's letter. I also gave him my pocket notebook with the overheard conversations, my careful log of times and dates. Paul listened without blinking, his reading glasses perched on his nose, and then he slid a copy of the LLC's original operating agreement across the table, the version filed with the county. It was stamped and dated, and the password clause was right there on page 14, buried in a paragraph labeled Special Member Protections. He said, "They are already in default on the bridge loan, which they took out using your identity. The lender is a hard money outfit out of Florida. I've alerted their fraud division and they are not happy. They've agreed to work with us if you're willing to help them gather the final proof, something that ties the notary stamp directly to Brett's hand. We need the digital trail, a direct link between his device and the counterfeit stamp order." I asked him what help meant. He handed me a small USB device the size of a fingernail, a hardware keylogger that would capture every keystroke on Brett's laptop if I could plug it in for just 90 seconds. He explained that the device would store the data internally and that I'd need to retrieve it and bring it back to him for extraction. I'd done basic IT support for Tom's office when money was tight, swapping hard drives and configuring printers, so I knew exact USB port locations on a MacBook Pro. I said yes without hesitation, and I drove home carrying a weapon made of silicon and code, feeling its weight in my palm like a key. Over the next 2 days, I watched the household's routine with the intensity of a hawk. I identified a pattern. Every weekday from 2 to 2:30, Amelia went to a yoga class at a studio 15 minutes away, and Brett took a conference call in the backyard, pacing near the grill, leaving his laptop unattended in the home office. I slipped in during that window, wearing cotton gloves I'd taken from Tom's workbench, and I plugged the keylogger into the rear USB-C port, tucked behind a desktop riser where the cord clutter would hide it. The device blinked once and went dark. I counted 90 seconds in my head while watching the backyard through the slatted blinds, my pulse a steady drum. Then I retrieved it, unplugging it with a soft click, and I was back in my room before Brett ended his call. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I hadn't triggered a single alert. I met Paul at the same diner 3 hours later, and he confirmed the capture was clean. Within 24 hours, his forensic accountant had extracted Brett's email to the counterfeit stamp vendor, a wire transfer receipt from a bank account I'd never seen, and a string of encrypted messages in which Brett bragged about handling the old lady and dancing on a grave. That digital paper trail was airtight, every keystroke a nail in their coffin. The maximum cruelty beat arrived on a Thursday, 5 days before the scheduled closing. I'd already planted the keylogger, and the evidence was streaming to Paul, but I needed one more piece, something that would prove intent beyond any doubt and also extinguish the last flicker of guilt I felt about destroying my dead husband's daughter. I decided to stage a medical scare. I'd rehearsed it in my mind a dozen times, mapping the fall to avoid injury, timing the moment when they'd be in earshot, and choosing a location where the light was good enough for a hidden camera. I had already purchased a tiny spy camera that looked like a phone charger, which I plugged into the wall outlet behind the sofa, its pinhole lens aimed at the living room floor. I tested it the night before and confirmed the picture was clear enough to capture facial expressions. At 1 in the afternoon, when Brett was on a video call in the den, and Amelia was in the kitchen scrolling through her phone, I stood up from the sofa, clutched my chest with both hands, and let out a strangled gasp that I'd practiced to sound genuinely panicked. I fell sideways, knocking over a side table and sending a ceramic lamp crashing to the tile floor. I landed hard on my left hip, protecting my head just enough to avoid real injury but letting it bounce off the grout line with a thud I knew would echo. I went limp. I kept my breathing shallow and my eyes half closed, and I watched through my lashes as Amelia turned slowly, her phone still in her hand. She looked down at me and her expression didn't change. There was no shock, no fear, no maternal instinct. She stepped right over my body, her bare foot almost brushing my face. She did not kneel, she did not call 911. She walked to the kitchen counter, picked up the manila folder with the closing documents and put it in her leather bag. Then I heard her voice, flat as a stamped ledger, say to Brett down the hall, "She's collapsed. If we're lucky, it's a heart attack. Don't call anyone until I get these papers locked in the car. We can't have paramedics here before the closing." I lay there for another 47 seconds, counting each one in my head while they argued about whether to wait a few more minutes to make sure, before I coughed, stirred, and groggily asked what happened. Amelia immediately shifted into a mask of concern, calling me a silly old thing and saying I'd just tripped. She even patted my shoulder with a cold hand. I could barely speak, not from the acting, but from the cold shock of finally seeing what she was. The woman who had once called me Mom on her good days, who had cried on my shoulder when her prom date stood her up, had just stepped over my body to protect a piece of paper that represented my stolen life. I had recorded the entire scene on the hidden charger camera, and the footage captured the fall, her indifferent step, and the conversation with chilling clarity. I uploaded it to a secure cloud account Paul had set up 2 hours later, and I knew then that no jury on earth would feel an ounce of sympathy for her. Confrontation day was a Friday, exactly 6 weeks after Tom's funeral. Brett drove us to the title company's office in a glass high-rise downtown, Amelia in the passenger seat applying lip gloss in the visor mirror, me in the back like a child, my canvas tote bag clutched in my lap. I wore my best confused old woman expression, a cardigan buttoned wrong, and I let my mouth hang slightly open. Inside the bag was the original metal lockbox with Tom's note now folded inside, the forged documents, the burner phone with all my photographic evidence, the thumb drive containing the keylogger data and the original operating agreement, and a certified copy of the UCC lien that Paul had couriered to me the night before. We were met by a notary public, a title officer with a nervous smile, and a man in a bad suit I recognized from Paul's briefing as the hard money lender's in-house counsel, a man named Kowalski who looked like he bit nails for breakfast. The developer's representative was already seated at the table, a man with a shark smile and a Montblanc pen that he tapped against the glass tabletop. Amelia slid the final folder toward me with a practiced grace. It was a fresh set of documents, a clean copy of the dissolution agreement with my forged signature already in place, and a closing statement that would wire the $800,000 to an escrow account that routed to an offshore bank in Nevis. She placed a heavy silver pen in my hand, a pen I'd never seen before. "Just sign here, Mom," she said, using a word she hadn't spoken in a decade. "This makes everything official. You'll be taken care of, I promise." Her voice dripped with false sweetness, and Brett stood behind her chair, his hand resting on her shoulder like a puppeteer. I looked at her for a long moment. She was sweating through her silk blouse, and a small bead of perspiration traced a line down her temple. Brett's foot was tapping a frantic rhythm under the table, a staccato that vibrated through the floor. I set the pen down and said, calmly into the silence of the room, "You never could forge my signature quite right, Amelia. The R in my name always had a loop I only make when I'm holding the pen and thinking of your father's voice. You traced it from a check I wrote to the farrier last spring, didn't you? But you forgot the pressure pattern. The original shows a heavier downstroke on the H because I was pressing hard against a counter, and your tracing is perfectly uniform all the way through. I have the check image to prove it, and you used a notary stamp that was revoked 6 months ago. I have the email where Brett ordered a counterfeit replacement from a counterfeiter in Shenzhen, and I have the wire transfer receipt to prove it." I withdrew the keylogger printout from my bag and laid it on the table, the keystroke log highlighted with the email text and the Bitcoin payment address. "Your bridge loan is in default. The UCC lien filed by Tom means this sale cannot close unless I am physically present, speaking a verbal password that only I know, and I will never speak it for you." Her face went white as the tablecloth. The color drained so fast I thought she might faint. Brett started to stand, his chair scraping the floor with a screech, but the conference room door opened and 2 federal agents in plain clothes walked in, their badges already out. Behind them was Paul Gerlach, holding a printout of the full evidence file and a certified copy of the UCC lien. The agent closest to Amelia, a woman with a sharp bun and no expression, said, "Amelia Harper, you are under arrest for wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse." Amelia screamed something about me being a crazy old woman, but they were already cuffing her wrists behind her back, the handcuffs clicking with a finality that echoed. Brett tried to talk his way out, explaining that he was just the husband. He didn't know anything, but the male agent read him his rights too without breaking eye contact, and the lender's counsel slid a civil complaint across the table for the full amount of the fraudulent loan, plus treble damages. The developer's man packed his Montblanc pen and left without a word, his pristine deal dead on arrival. His shark smile vanished. I sat at that table while they cleared the room, the air still humming with the aftermath. I opened the metal lockbox one more time, the note's ink faded but still legible. I didn't need to read it. I already knew it by heart. But I traced the fading ink with my thumb and thought about how Tom had seen the worst in his own daughter and still found the strength to protect me from beyond the grave, setting a trap that sprang exactly when I needed it. The password Cottonwood, the street where we met at a July block party, and he spilled lemonade on my shoes, was a secret I would carry until my own grave. The aftermath took about a year to fully unwind, but every single consequence landed exactly where it belonged. Amelia pled guilty to 3 felony counts of forgery and 1 count of wire fraud, and the sentencing judge added an enhancement for elder abuse after watching the video of her stepping over my body, which Paul played in open court on a large projection screen. The judge, a woman with steel grey hair, paused the video on the frame where Amelia's foot hovered over my head and said, "I've seen many things in this courtroom, but the calculated cruelty of this act demands a message." Amelia was sentenced to 4 years in a state correctional facility, and I made sure the court-ordered restitution included every penny of the bridge loan they'd taken out in my name, plus the cost of repairing my credit, which forced the sale of their house and the liquidation of their remaining assets. Brett got 18 months for conspiracy and wire fraud, which he served in a federal camp after being permanently disbarred from the real estate industry in our state and 3 neighboring states. The hard money lender, furious at being used as an unwitting pawn, sued them separately in civil court and attached their personal assets, their leased BMW, their beach timeshare, and the joint bank account that still had $11,000. They lost everything, including the house Amelia had called hers. It was auctioned on the courthouse steps on a drizzly Tuesday, and I drove past it once, just once, to see the foreclosure notice taped to the door with yellow packing tape. I didn't smile. I nodded, a single downward tilt of my chin, and I kept driving. The stable came back to me, clean and unencumbered. The court awarded me sole ownership of the LLC, voiding every fraudulent document Amelia had filed and affirming the original operating agreement with its password provision. I used a portion of the restitution to pay off the remaining mortgage Tom and I had on the property, and I had a little left to build a proper all-weather arena with a drainage system that wouldn't flood every spring, designed by an engineer who specialized in equestrian footing. I hired the same framing crew Tom would have trusted, and I was there every day, not as a supervisor, but as a worker in my barn coat, pulling Romex for the new lighting circuits and setting fence posts deep enough to survive a mudslide. I didn't want dressage ponies with braided manes and trust funds. Instead, I partnered with a nonprofit called Heartland Minis that trains miniature therapy horses for children with autism and veterans with PTSD, and I gave them free board in exchange for using my space for their sessions. The first time I watched a nonverbal child press his palm against a miniature horse named Toby and whisper the word, "soft," I cried in the tack room where no one could see. Then the county sheriff's mounted patrol unit, a department that had once investigated Brett's shell company, called and asked if they could stable 4 of their retired police draft horses in my barn. These were horses that had served the county for years, Percherons and a single Belgian cross, and they needed a quiet place to live out their retirement. I said yes without hesitating. Now every morning I walk outside at sunrise to the sound of draft horses nickering in the fog, their warm breath clouding the air, and a miniature horse named Toby who licks my palm for peppermints. I muck my own stalls still, because the rhythm of it clears my mind, and I replace the bedding with pine shavings that smell like Tom's workshop. And I installed a camera at the main gate. It's a high-definition security camera with infrared night vision, mounted on a treated 4x4 post I set in 2 feet of concrete. I wired it myself, running shielded PoE cable through the same underground conduit I'd installed years ago for the arena lights, and I configured the motion alerts to ping my phone with a custom sound, a horse whinny I downloaded from a sound library. The camera's public live feed name, displayed on a simple website I built with a template, is Stable Justice. The feed shows the gate, the gravel drive, and a laminated sign I bolted to the post with stainless steel screws. The sign reads, "Amelia Harper is permanently banned from these premises. This is a condition of her parole and the permanent restraining order. If you see her here, call 911 immediately." The county judge signed off on the order and noted in her ruling that the public livestream constituted adequate public notice, binding under state law. I check the feed every night before I go to sleep, the glow of the screen on my face, and sometimes I see a pair of headlights slow down near the gate, pause, and then drive away. People from the comment section, strangers who found the feed through a local news story, send me screenshots of the empty driveway and tell me they've been watching for hours, just to make sure. The quiet army of strangers who believe in a widow's competence is a force I never expected to deserve, but I welcome it. I keep the camera's DVR recordings in a fireproof safe next to Tom's lockbox, because proof is a habit I will never break. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If you believe that quiet competence and a well-filed UCC lien can outlast all the glossy smiles in the world, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of justice that builds slow and lasts forever. I'll see you next time.